Hello and welcome everybody. Let me introduce you to this new City Skylines series where we will be building the city of Altengrad. The city is located in some fictional country in Central Europe. It was founded many centuries ago, and because of its location, it was home for many people from many different cultures and nations, which heavily influenced its architecture, its expansion, and even its name. This particular place where it all started is a lowland region where two largest rivers of the country meet, and the confluence of these rivers is exactly where our story begins. Now, this series will be a tiny bit different, as we are not going to start building the city as it would be in the early 21st century, the present day, but we will go back in time, maybe close to 100 years into the past, to begin building the city. This means that we are going to be building Altengrad as it was somewhere between 1920 to 1930. We are going to stay in this time period for quite some time to build pretty much the entire city and even some smaller towns and villages around it, which would later be consumed by the expanding city of Altengrad to become its city parts. After that is done, we are going to move forward in time. We will start using some modern architecture, different principles regarding new types of housing and road structures, of course. I plan to then advance all the way to the modern era and maybe slightly to the future. Every time we advance forward in time, there will be some changes to the already built areas of the city. Some structures will be demolished, maybe entire city blocks will have to make way for some new roads, highways, railroads, or underground public transport, or new forms of housing. And of course, just like in real life, some of these changes might be viewed as mistakes in hindsight, so future reworks could be possible as well, just like in real life cities nowadays. Just to be clear, this city is not going to be a recreation of any real life city, even though similarities will be quite obvious, because I of course draw inspiration from cities I know. I will try to be as realistic as possible, but I am no historian and no city planner, so some things might not be exactly 100% accurate, but I will try to justify whatever I'm building by providing some explanation on how or why was something done in a certain way. Not just say that I built it because I thought it was cool, even though that's obviously going to be quite important. And of course, it's still just a game with limited capabilities, so many things are just not possible in this game, and I will have to improvise and make some compromises, some of which I'll probably talk about today. This leads me into the origins of this idea. Why build a European city? Why start in the past and then advance forward? I think it all started around this time last year when I was still building the city of Rockdale before the Aurelia project. And I really wanted to get into some sort of detailing projects like maybe construction site for the very first metro station of a city. Something that might have happened in cities like 50 years ago, let's say. I even searched for pictures of construction sites like that, black and white pictures. But such a project would not exactly fit into Rockdale, and I didn't want to do projects like that in the upcoming Aurelia, or just do projects like that completely separate from any series. Then I, for some reason that I don't remember, started learning about some not so old history of housing development, for example, in my country, of course, how infrastructure developed in big cities, and just how cities basically changed in the second half of the 20th century. So I wanted to use that somehow in City Skylines. And then I found the Franklin City Skyline series here on YouTube, which, not gonna lie, is a huge inspiration for this. Probably don't need to introduce it too much because many of you know it. It's a series made by Do Not Eat, creator recently featured on the official City Skylines channel. If you don't know it, I highly recommend that you go and watch it. It's a series where Do Not Eat uses city skylines to show how an American city developed over time, while also educating the viewers on various things that were typical for those time periods, including politics and all kinds of things. Unlike Franklin, though, I would like to focus more on the game, on the looks of Altengrad, while not really getting too much into politics, policies, and all that, simply because I just don't have the knowledge. But if I want to somehow explain why I'm building something the way I do, I will have to do at least some research in all kinds of relevant topics. And this is actually a very nice side effect that this series will have, and that is the fact that I will simply need to educate myself first. Look at some old pictures, old maps, maybe do some reading. I already had to read stuff about architectural styles in this part of Europe, for example, or the history of road surfaces, which was very, very important for the start of this series. I always wanted to learn stuff like this, and this series just brings perfect motivation for me to do so, so that's cool. Now, for the reason we start, like I said, around 1920s, 1930s, it is simply because that is the time period you can somewhat successfully recreate in city skylines if you want your city to function, because you need vehicles, and cars available in the workshop are from this time period. Also, from this time period, there is already a nice amount of old photographs from real life and stuff like that, which is good. Anyway, a first tiny little lesson in history. The 1920s were very important in Central Europe. It was just a few years since the Great War, later known as the First World War, ended, which marked huge political changes. Many countries were formed or reformed, democracies replaced monarchies, and so on. But now for the actual city. What is happening in the time-lapse? What am I working on? As the name of the city suggests, there probably should be a castle, but since castles are no longer really needed in this time period, and they haven't been really needed for quite some time already, the castle was replaced by more modern palaces and, just nicer looking buildings in this area. Now, the most important thing every time you start a new city, and many of you probably know that, the most difficult thing is to, place the first building, place the first street, to kind of get the better idea of, on how to continue from there, right? So that's exactly what was really difficult with this project as well. I decided that we are going to start building the palace quarter, we could call it, by using all kinds of buildings from the workshop. I'm mostly going to use buildings made by Titan in the workshop creator, who is making all these nice buildings from the past, like Renaissance buildings that I'm using in here. I think those are made by Titan. I might be mistaken there, but he definitely made the palace buildings, the complex of those palace buildings that I was building. And in the beginning. So that's a very, very nice asset. Pretty much everyone is using that one in their European historical cities, and I'm obviously no exception here. So that was the most important thing because it was the first building that I placed. I decided to use the version of the castle that, or palace I should probably call it in this case. I used the version that's from the version that's not complete, the one that is made up from all kinds of buildings as individual buildings, right? So I can use them, how I see fit. I didn't really want to create it as like a closed castle like it is in real life, because that is a real life castle, but I used just the individual buildings to form some sort of a wall of buildings, let's say. And later it's going to be more clear, and obviously in the cinematics at the end of the episode it's going to be more clear how I meant to build it. Now, a very important thing is something that I already kind of talked about, the compromises that I need to make in order to create the city as realistically as I can. And that has to do with the surfaces. Now, if you want to create a European city, and many people do it that way, they usually just switch the pavement texture or the concrete texture for cobblestone. That is definitely the easiest way of doing that, but I can't really do it in this particular project. So you can see me that I have still the concrete texture for the pavement in here, and that's because later, as we obviously move forward in time, the concrete surface, or the pavement, whatever you want to call it, is obviously going to be more common than cobblestone. But we kind of need to have both, because cobblestone is going to stay in the city center, in this part of the city, the historical city. But we obviously need to have, some kind of more modern surfaces, in some modern, quarters of the city. So we need both. That's kind of what I'm trying to say here. We need both, which means that we need to keep the concrete texture, and then we need to use cobblestone. We need to place cobblestone in some different ways. So, for example, decals, that's probably the most important one, but also by downloading some different roads from the workshop that already have cobblestone texture. That's especially that brownish cobblestone road that I was using just a few moments ago, and that's a road that I will be using a lot more during building the historical town center, because that road is absolutely perfect. But there's obviously the problem then of blending together all kinds of different surfaces, because it's not really easy. I will probably talk a bit more about it later, because I'm probably going to show you how I'm going to do it from now on. Now, I'm also building this very important building in here. I kind of want to imagine that this might have been the place where the old castle used to be, let's say, on this little piece of mountain. Obviously, doing extensive terraforming in here. This was completely flat area, and I raised it to form this slightly elevated palace quarter, let's say. But it's obviously not done. The terrain is obviously going to be a bit more better around the palace that we built just a few moments ago, and obviously even this quarter in here. But right now it is like this. So I built that slightly more modern palace, which actually might have been built in this time. It might have been built relatively recently. Maybe it was like the newest palace for maybe some kind of a royal family or something like that. Nowadays, in the 1920s, it's probably going to be some kind of a presidential palace, I would imagine. So that's exactly where the ruler of the land, of the country, would probably reside. Or if it's not the capital city, then maybe someone else. But I would kind of like to imagine that this is a capital city in the country. So we are going to do that palace in some later episodes. Right now, I'm just doing this entrance towards it. So I did that bridge there. I made it very wide, but later I'm actually going to make it pretty much stock again, like it was before I widen it with procedural objects. But right now I decided to do it like this. But the palace itself, I just placed the building there, but I don't really want to continue doing the surroundings of it too much, because I'm not exactly sure how it's going to look like. I think I would like to do some kind of gardens, or maybe like vineyards or something like that underneath the castle on the opposite side of this trench or moat, whatever you want to call it. But I'm just not sure how to continue with it. That's all. Now, this palace is not really the focus of my attention at this point. I just really wanted to finish the front of it, so that the view from this square that I'm finishing in here is going to be somewhat complete. Now, the trench between the palace and this quarter, this square, is also kind of not really finished. I'm not so sure about the road, for example, or detailing inside it. I don't think I detailed the inside of it in any way, and I'm still not sure where the road from underneath the bridge is going to lead to. On one side, it's obviously leading to the river, where there's only a gravel road there. But again, we will see how it's going to turn out. I have so many plans at this point already for all kinds of expansion, or well, not expansion, but changes that might come to this quarter, or even just the surrounding areas, once we advance in time. For example, the road by the river might get changed to some kind of a tram road, even, some kind of modern road like that. So many different ideas for the changes that we might apply to the city when we advance forward in time. Now, in here, I'm building the square in front of the palace. I made sure that the bridge is exactly centered to the entrance to the palace, and the square is somewhat centered to the bridge itself as well. But not completely, because, things like that are kind of rare in these times. And also these buildings are, much older than the palace. So it kind of makes sense that they don't exactly align with how the palace is built. And the cathedral that I have in there, obviously, is much older than all of these buildings probably. So there's that. Now, this is the important thing that I kind of almost talked about, and that is the thresholds, or the borders between the various surfaces, the various decals. Now, the way the game works, you cannot overlap decals, so that is a bit of an issue. But fortunately, I have that cobblestone road, which already is textured with cobblestone, so it's not decals, which means that I can put some decals over it and just blend it. I'm using Move It to kind of make the textures more opaque. Is that the word I'm looking for? Probably. so that the texture underneath it kind of shows through, but the texture over it is somewhat still visible. Now, obviously, that's not exactly realistic because, in real life, you would probably have just some cobblestone ending and then different kind of cobblestone, starting. But with those kinds of, terrains, well, not terrain, but shapes in there, it's just very difficult to do so with the decals, the way they work in this game. So that's kind of like a tiny little compromise that I will just have to make and, be all right with it. So now we move to this other palace that's on this side of this quarter. Now, this is obviously, like I said, the first building that I placed in here, but you could have seen me actually changing it many, many times before. And it was really, really difficult to get it, just right. It probably isn't just right at this point anyway, but it's much better than it used to be at the start. Now, I created some kind of a retaining wall, these days a retaining wall in here, but I want to imagine that that's probably the remnant, let's say, of the old city wall or maybe the castle wall. That probably was a lot taller, but these days it's just like a little stone railing to prevent people from falling down the hill from this garden. Now, this castle is much older than this one. This one is like a Baroque style, so it might actually have been built quite recently, well, like 50 years ago, let's say, maybe by the ruling families. But the older palace, the one made by Titan, is a Renaissance building, so that's way older, but it might have been also serving the same purpose, just in different times. But obviously, it was kind of an important building, so they kept it there, even though they built the new palace. And the old palace might now be some sort of like a lesser government building or something like that. It might be some kind of an office of some important figures in the government, or it might even be a museum, but maybe in more like more newer times than this one. So the front of the new palace, I was not really sure how to do it. I later decided, and this is probably the result of it, to simplify it a lot. I really wanted to put cobblestone at first, absolutely everywhere, but then I decided that it would be much better to just keep it a bit more green. So I just put the cobblestone only where it's really necessary to, gain the entrance towards the palace front and even to these side buildings. Now, these side buildings in here might be maybe some like old stables, for example, or just, some support buildings for the new palace. Now we are looking at the road that's actually leading from the trench, and I decided to do some like old detailing in here. I decided to put this tiny little wall in here, which might actually not be all that super old. It might have been constructed here somewhat recently, but I really wanted to put some ruins in here. So this is a perfect place for it, and I figured that this might have been maybe one of the entrances to the old castle, and maybe we had some old watchtower ruins in this area. So in this era, it's probably not really considered all that important to have these ruins in here, but I would really like to keep these ruins in here all the way to the modern era, when they would probably become very important historical landmarks. Well, not really landmarks, but you know how it is with these old ruins. People are usually trying to preserve them. Alright, we went through the first episode a lot faster than I imagined, so there's probably a lot of things that I forgot to mention. Almost didn't touch the topic of all the different styles, where some buildings are more modern than others, what was the reason behind that, and so on. But there are more episodes to come, so more opportunities to cover most of that. And for the first introduction episode, it's probably fine. Last few things. I forgot to mention one important thing that you will notice in the cinematics, so before you complain about it, hear me out. I did not figure out how to get rid of certain citizen models, so we will see the vanilla citizens' clothing, which obviously doesn't belong to this era. If you guys know of any way to change the appearance of citizens, let me know, please. Next week, we will do some more building and detailing, and we will take a look at some old market square, so stay tuned for that. I really hope you guys will enjoy Altengrad, and I hope you liked its first episode. If you did, then you can always put a thumbs up underneath it, share the video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel if you're new here. Thank you for watching, take care, and goodbye.